Coming up, a special programme covering the great innovators of history. The people whose inventions and innovations dragged us kicking and screaming from our extremely rural-pilled and cottagecore pasts to the sunlit uplands of the workhouse, the child orphanage, and the fast-fashion sweatshop. These masters of ideas have changed the world with their brilliant minds, whether we're talking about the iPhone, the light bulb, or the humble microphone, which, as we all was... Wait, the microphone was invented by whom? Dan, you told me this was a German job. Oh, you know, German like older German, like Nazi. Anyway, in my notes it says that there were no residents of the Third Reich involved in the invention of the microphone after all. Well, if that's true, then your editorial line is useless to me. I suppose Nazis didn't invent highways either, or make the trains run on time. Oh no. My fact checker's on the line. My friends, they don't make them like they used to. Hello? So the Nazis didn't invent microphones? Oh, damn. They didn't invent highways? Well then, they didn't make the trains run on time, I suppose. Well then, what exactly did the Nazis do? Yeah, well, besides that, obviously. Okay, I'll ask him. Thank you. Dan, were you taking your history lessons from Ye? Apologies, audience. No one in this building besides me had ever heard of Ye until this year. They didn't know he was a college dropout, otherwise they would have turned away from him immediately. They're all snobs here, you see. And I don't think they've even heard any one of his songs in passing. Gold Digger is the name of Lord Nonce-Bottom's taxidermied bloodhound, and the only dark twisted fantasy anyone in this office has ever had involves a blood ritual where the blood of the poor is sacrificed daily to the British press to ensure the Conservatives rules in perpetuity, their hearts and hands drenched in the blood of the innocent. You see, it's just not their thing. Oh dear, I've lost you. Hold on then. Perhaps I should explain myself. I'm Bridget Empire, science and culture correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, Britain's least credulous newspaper, and today I'm here to clear up some things about Nazi inventions and guide a wayward rapper back into the stage of conservatism my editors would really rather he stay in. You see, it's all good to be a fascist, as Lord Nonce-Bottom always tells me in my mandatory brainwashing sessions with him that I have to go to whenever I say something too left-wing. But you can't say you're a fascist. If Ye was doing everything exactly the same, except replacing certain phrases with euphemisms, everyone at the Daily Telegraph would have to concede he's just a run-of-the-mill conservative, and then we'd have to keep interviewing him. You see, for this right-wing media ecosystem to thrive, as it has been, we need to stick to our dog whistles. Yay. Pointers. Instead of the Jews. This computer is anti-Semitic, I swear. Instead of the Jews, how about globalists or liberal Hollywood elites? Instead of I love Hitler, how about I love my country? I'm just concerned about illegal immigration, or I don't know, pretty much anything other than saying that particular thing out loud, because that's where you get in trouble. Now, as someone who was born after the fall of the Roman Empire, I understand quite well, unlike my colleagues at this blasted newspaper, that Ye is bipolar, and that a lot of this recent media blitz has been exploiting a man going through a manic episode. That doesn't excuse what he's saying for even a second, and it doesn't make him immune from culpability for the hate he's spreading. But it is the reason why the mentions of Ye in this video will stop here for the most part. My intention here is to debunk some Nazi myths, and make fun of the conservative reaction to someone finally saying the quiet part out loud, rather than making fun of a man who clearly needs help, and to not be on interviews and air shows and cable news shows and all that stuff. Hopefully that's how this comes across, and if not, feel free to cancel me. Lord Nonce-Bottom will love that. He's been waiting for one of us to get cancelled. No one at the Daily Telegraph has been cancelled since Lord Nonce-Bottom himself called Henry VIII a messy bitch for killing his wife in 1536. So at risk of losing my job for spilling too much tea about my bosses, let me welcome you, dear viewer, to this week's Empire Statement. Ah, the humble microphone. The tool that's amplified so many of the great voices of the 20th and 21st century. Everyone from Angela Davis to Alex Jones, from Ray Charles to Mr. Blobby. It's a common myth, spread by neo-Nazis and those susceptible to their rhetoric, such as certain USA-based cable networks, that the Nazis, or even Hitler specifically, invented the microphone. Now, Under the Third Reich, a lot of things get credited to Hitler, because that's part of the mythology of Nazi Germany, the supreme authority of the Führer and all that stuff that our friends over at the Daily Mail are super into. In a way, this is a sort of natural obfuscation that happens with the passage of time. The Emperor Hadrian didn't build Hadrian's Wall himself. He had a bunch of other people do that for him. He had more important stuff to do as emperor, like growing a beard and having sex with men. The thing is, though, the microphone wasn't invented by Hitler, nor was it invented by any Nazi. It wasn't even invented in Germany, or even in that same time period. Surprise, surprise, when we talk about great things that the Nazis supposedly did, more often than not, we're falling for propaganda from the Third Reich itself, and if not then its ideological successors. The history of the invention of the microphone is actually pretty messy, because the invention of different components, the nature of filing patents versus actually coming up with the working technology, and if we skip the earlier iterations of sound enhancement technology from ancient Greek theatre masks to cups attached with wire, we get to something we might recognise as something close to a modern microphone in 1856, when Antonio Meucci invented a microphone that generated an electric current by moving a coil of wire within a magnetic field, with the vibrating diaphragm of the microphone altering the electric current within the field, which would then reproduce the sound fed into it. This was followed by innovations from Johann Reich in 1861 and 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray, from whom we get the first microphone patent. Although, by all accounts, that microphone was actually quite shit. Still, all of this was 13 years before Hitler was even born, so he obviously, by definition, had nothing to do with it. The first non-shit microphone was developed around 1877, with credit divided between David Hughes, Emile Berliner, and Thomas Edison, all of whom you might note were not Adolf Hitler. Although, if you're the sort of person who ascribes everything even vaguely German-sounding to Hitler, I suppose you could do worse than someone with the name Berliner. What fascist sympathisers might be referring to when they talk about Hitler inventing microphones, however, might be the Neumann bottle microphone, which Hitler did use, and you could argue, given his profile, may have had a role in popularising. But it was designed in 1928 by Georg Neumann, and Hitler had absolutely no hand in it. In fact, Hitler wouldn't become Chancellor until the 1930s, so even if we're talking about this microphone, not only did Hitler have no part in its invention, but he wasn't even top dog when this was invented, which is the technical term for Führer. No one's going around calling it the Weimar microphone, at least not that I know of, so why are we acting like Hitler had something to do with it? We know the notable things Hitler did. They're super horrible, and maybe the reason we're stuck talking about inventions or infrastructure he may or may not, but let's face it, may not have had hand in, is because the people who look at the 1930s and think, fuck yes, instead of never again, really don't want us thinking about the horrible shit the Nazis did and how we stop them doing it again. They'd rather have us running in circles, or better yet, complimenting this murderous, utterly evil regime for something they didn't even fucking do, because it makes them look like they were, at least in some sectors, efficient and productive. The thing is, they weren't. They were pretty dysfunctional from the start. According to Alfred Speer's Inside the Third Reich, written by Hitler's personal architect, a modern industrialized economy is a highly complex entity with lots of moving parts. Mobilizing it for efficient war efforts is also highly complicated, but Hitler would frequently make sudden decisions, or worse, no decision at all. He would encourage his underlings to compete against each other, and carve out their own spheres of influence. In order to encourage this, Hitler would often delay, hesitate, or be ambiguous about delineating spheres of responsibility. The result was very often inefficiency, scaled throughout the German economy and war effort. Often, this inefficiency slid into administrative chaos, rather than being organised in the modern fashion. Hitler's rule increasingly looked like a medieval court, where rival underlings would compete. The result was a lack of clear decision-making lines of authority. You ended up with strange things like a paratrooper panzer division because Hermann Göring wanted to have a tank division. The SS also wanted their own tank divisions, so you ended up with the SS ones too. The economy was a good example of this chaos. Who was in control of the economy? Well, Göring, again, had control of the economy's 4-year plan, and directly controlled several major industries, but Speer was in charge of actual war production. But someone else was in charge of obtaining resources from outside the country, and the SS also controlled parts of the economy, so who made economic decisions? Who set policy? Nobody was clearly in charge, and that seemed to just be the way Hitler liked it. It might be inefficient, but it also made sure nobody could challenge Hitler's rule, and that meant good policy meant cultivating good relations not just with Hitler, but with the courtiers that surrounded him and controlled access to him. So, to take an example from Speer's book, let's say you're in charge of labour mobilisation. You decide to close some non-essential businesses like restaurants and luxury goods manufacturers because there's a war on, and we need to save money and get more workers into the factories. Well, maybe on paper you have the authority to do it, but Goering doesn't want to. He likes those restaurants, and because he owns some of the luxury retailers, he likes fine furs, also the local Nazi governors refuse to release the workers or close down the businesses because they fear it'll be bad for morale. Also, even if you get the workers released, the army demands they get conscripted rather than go to the factories, so you have political deadlock. In a normal functioning administrative system, there would be a single ministry or office that would take care of this sort of thing, process the interests of the stakeholders, and reach a binding decision that makes sure everyone is on the same page. If things really don't get resolved, you get the executive to intervene. Except Hitler didn't want anyone else having such authority, and he would dither on making decisions until it was too late, and even when he did, it would be deliberately ambiguous about the details, which led to more infighting and more confusion. A lot of Nazi Germany's efficiency was actually left over from its pre-Nazi days, and the Nazis steadily wore down on that as well as time went on. Credit to Zaradeptus on r Ask Historians for that one. r Ask Historians, the only good subreddit. Sorry, Bread2, please don't unsubscribe, please come back, please. So it sounds like Hitler didn't invent the microphone, nor did he run an efficient society. In fact, the commonly held myth that I heard and internalized growing up doesn't seem to have been true either, that being that the Nazis made the trains run on time. When World War II would come up in conversation growing up, you would quite often hear the adage, Hitler did terrible things, but he did make the trains run on time, which people I don't think meant to use to soften the edge of a regime steeped in atrocities and genocidal to its very core, but the result of repeating this propaganda instead of looking into it and discovering that it's false kind of does just that. In fact, the Nazis were very much unable to make Germany's trains run on time. According to Tooze, The Wages of Destruction, bottlenecks and jams radiated across the system. Crashes multiplied, with 2 major disasters just before Christmas, claiming the lives of 230 people and shaking public confidence. Over the winter of 1939 to 1940, Gestapo informants on platforms across the country reported public outrage at delays and arbitrary cancellations. The rail administrators struggled to ease the problems of freight traffic by cutting passenger services wholesale, but even drastic measures could not prevent a crisis. By 1940, tens of thousands of freight cars were frozen in kilometres of log jams. So, the trains certainly weren't running on time at all, and in fact, this myth seems to be directly lifted from fascist propaganda. More specifically, the propaganda machine of Benito Mussolini, who saw building a railway industry that connected a newly united Italy as a proxy for his building a new image of Italy on the world stage. Mussolini apparently poured quite a lot of money into this, and the claim that the fascists made the trains run on time came from the Italian Ministry of Propaganda itself, as documented by Philip Cannistraro in Consensus Factory. A concerted effort was made to spread this idea, and as fascism spread, so did the propaganda of the OG fascist regime spread to its more famous brother, from Il Duce to the Führer, and yet the trains of Nazi Germany, if anything was good about them, had massive industrial investments from the days of Bismarck to World War I to thank, and even then, they stopped working. They didn't run on time. Quite the opposite. Okay. So maybe Hitler didn't invent the microphone, or make the trains run on time, but Dan told me earlier that he invented the highway too. Guess if that one was right, Dan? Good, yeah, it wasn't. This is what happens when you make someone whose brain has long since turned into soup and into an editor of a major newspaper. You need to read a book, Dan. Not Mein Kampf. You've read that one far too many times. In fact, Dan, just listen to this. From Newsweek, the form of road infrastructure now commonly referred to in the US as a highway also predates Hitler's time as leader of Germany. The earliest US example of a highway is the Long Island Motor Parkway, also known as the Vanderbilt Parkway, which began construction in June 6, 1908, according to the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. It was the first long-distance reinforced concrete highway, using bridges and overpasses to eliminate cross-traffic and curves for safety and speed, as NYC Parks website says, and describes the parkway, which is now a bicycle path, as America's first limited-access road for cars. Ye might have been referring to the German Autobahn system of highways, which saw heavy involvement from the Nazi government in the 1930s. However, neither Hitler nor the Nazi Party invented the Autobahn, though, records indicate they did attempt to take some credit for it through their propaganda. German news outlet Deutsche Welle published a report about the Nazis' involvement with the Autobahn in 2012, calling the idea that the Nazis invented them a historical fiction. Germany was initially unable to build highways at all, due to financial constraints that followed World War I. The first Autobahn to be successfully financed and built was opened in 1932 between the German cities of Bonn and Cologne. It was the brainchild of Konrad Adenauer, then mayor of Cologne, who would go on to become the Chancellor of West Germany. Deutsche Welle notes that the Nazi regime supported Autobahn construction in the 30s and used the highways as part of their propaganda. Prisoners and Jewish forced labourers were also brought in to build the Autobahns after the outbreak of World War II. So, he didn't invent the highway, he didn't invent the Autobahn, he just tried to take the credit for it. much like Mussolini with the Italian train system. And the fact that we see prominent celebrities talking about this as if it's true speaks to the aims of the far right overall. By trying to push this line, it gives them a line to give to anyone who tries to condemn the Nazis outright, even though, if they had invented the highway, which they didn't, that wouldn't excuse them from murdering 6 million people. Obviously. This whataboutism, though, is common in arguments from the far right, something you might have seen recently in response to questions about the Holocaust, where a lot of figures on the right have started to say, what about abortion? Even if you agree that abortion is bad, which most people don't, it doesn't make it right to do a Holocaust, obviously. But it did make you stop and think. It may by chance have stopped your train of thought, might have caused you to double back mentally, and that's all you need in a debate, not facts, which is why debating is fucking stupid. Dan went to a debate club, and he believes all of this shit, and I didn't, because when I was at uni, I was too busy drinking vodka cokes and throwing up in whichever toilet I didn't get kicked out of immediately. The main point of this is, if we're being real here, and I'm sure Dan would like me to be, given that this gives a bit of prestige to the British, on the same page again, this is how I keep this job, people. The one thing that Hitler really did get done, the horrific crimes against humanity, which really should be the thing we remember about his vile regime, were alterations on inventions from outside Germany too. Although the death camp might be one of the few things we can actually give credit to the Nazis for, a disgusting stain on the history of humanity that it is, the concentration camp itself was previously used by the British in South Africa during the Boer War, and before that by the Spanish in Cuba. Germany got a lot of inspiration from American racism too, such as the idea of manifest destiny, which is an idea that you can see almost copy and pasted into the Nazi concept of Lebensraum. And of course, fascism itself is an Italian invention, if not credited to Benito Mussolini himself, then to Italian poet and sex pest Gabriele D'Annunzio. Hitler didn't even invent the Hitler salute. That's the Italian fascist symbol, the Roman salute, based on one used by the lower classes in Roman society when addressing their superiors. What I suppose I'm saying is, the only things the Nazis really innovated were the sheer scale of horror a single force could unleash upon the world. When we think of Hitler, we shouldn't be thinking about trains or microphones or highways. We should be thinking about the thing that he's actually responsible for, the Holocaust. And, knowing the sheer scale of that tragedy, vow to never let the evil of fascism rise again. Everything beyond that is a deflection. Nick Fuentes might go around on a rapper's arm trying to make people discuss the merits of a Nazi regime, and because the shows that are hosting him on don't care to check, he and his ilk can get away with changing the mental image of what Nazism is in people's minds to something watered down, something more practical, more based in economy and invention than the truth, that the Nazi regime was, from the start, wedded to an ideology of genocide. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Don't let them muddy the waters. There is nothing good about Nazis, and if you think you know better, I dare you to actually read up on it, because the sources are out there. World War II is one of the most well-studied historical events. You can be pretty sure about all of this. No matter what lies you spin, no matter what dog whistles you use, you can't polish a turd. Don't let fascists convince you that you can. Nazis will always find ways to target those that they think they can convert to their side, when they're at the most vulnerable, when they're ready for comforting lies about what the real problems are with society and how to solve them. We all know there's something wrong with society today. But it's capitalism. It isn't working. It's failing us and hard, but Nazis know they can use this. Fascism, as the saying goes, is capitalism decay. To prevent an upending of the social order, fascists scapegoat and organise and build rigid hierarchies from which they can take the reins for themselves. They cannot be allowed to do this again. We need not live through a repeat of the 1930s and 40s. We have the foresight this time. We have history as a guide. Use it. Use it against them. Use knowledge to stop them in their tracks. Deflect their propaganda before you can swallow it. And build your defences, your community, your solidarity with the most marginalised. We won't be surprised this time. Not by Nazis. We know. We've seen them coming. In the 1930s, the Nazis burned the early history of transgender science in front of the world. We can see people lining up to do the same thing right now. This time, we've seen them coming. We won't be caught by surprise again. We won't let anyone else die at their hands. Are you with me? I hope you are. And as always, thanks for watching. Dan? Dan, are you there? Dan? Oh, good. He fell asleep. He always sleeps with his eyes open like that. I wondered how I'd gotten away with bashing Nazis for so long. If anyone asked viewers, I said that the Nazis were bad, but that conservatism is the only alternative. I don't think they can hold that against me. I didn't promote socialism even once in this video. If I'd known Dan was asleep, I probably would have. Anyway, until next time, puppets, all that's left for me to do is thank my patrons. Now, I love my patrons. It's because of them that I am slightly less shit scared about my bills this winter. If you don't want to see me freeze to death in the cold dark streets of Liverpool, why not join them? It starts from £1 a month, and in the new year, I'm going to set up a Discord to go with it. Besides that, sometimes you get videos early. Wouldn't that be grand? Thank you to Naomi Wayne, Joey Cobalt, Scarjan, Charles TS MTMS, and Narania for your support. It means the world to me. Merry Christmas to all, and to all, smelt fascismu.